On the morning of January 18, 1975, federal agents knocked on the front door of a house in Teaneck, New Jersey. The man who answered was Frank Lucas, alone, unarmed, and completely unprepared. His wife was upstairs. Within seconds of the door swinging open, she was already at a rear window, throwing bags stuffed with cash into the yard below. The agents watched her do it, but they let her keep going as evidence. When they finally swept the house, they uncovered the remaining 7 suitcases packed tight with street cash, 10s, 20s, all stacked and bundled, nearly $585,000 in total, along with keys to safe deposit boxes registered in the Cayman Islands. That was Frank Lucas on the day it ended. But in his prime, the story looked very different. By the late 1960s, New York City was being hollowed out one neighborhood at a time by a heroin epidemic that had been building for nearly 2 decades. The scale of the crisis by the early 1970s had become something that resists easy description. Law enforcement estimated there were approximately 500,000 heroin addicts across the United States by the early part of that decade, and roughly 200,000 of them were concentrated in New York City alone. That number meant that in a single city, in a country of over 200 million people, 1 out of every 4 addicts in the entire nation lived within 5 boroughs. The weight of that statistic did not distribute evenly. It settled into the poorest neighborhoods and stayed there. Harlem bore more of that weight than anywhere else. Addiction rates there ran 12 times the national average. The crime rate was 50% higher than the rest of New York City as a whole. Investigators who worked those streets during that period have described finding needles in schoolyards, watching emaciated people stagger along sidewalks in the middle of the afternoon, responding to overdose calls in apartments where children lived alongside parents who had stopped functioning. The physical landscape of addiction was visible on nearly every block. It was not hidden. It was simply accepted as the condition of that particular place. The supply behind all of that had a clear and well-documented owner. Throughout the 1960s, the Italian Mafia's 5 families, the Bonanos, Colombos, Gambinos, Genoveses, and Luccheses, all headquartered in and around New York City, controlled approximately 80 to 95% of the heroin entering the United States. The pipeline that made this possible had been refined over decades. Raw opium was cultivated in Turkey, transported to Corsican chemical operators in Marseille, France, refined into heroin, and then smuggled into the United States, often in the hollow frames of cars, in commercial freight, in compartments engineered to be invisible to standard customs inspection. The press called it the French Connection. Law enforcement agencies spent the better part of a decade trying to dismantle it, largely without success. Black dealers in Harlem did not own that pipeline. They bought from it. Figures like Frank Matthews, who had built a coast-to-coast distribution network that stretched from New York to cities across the South and Midwest, and Leroy Nicky Barnes, who coordinated a loose council of major Harlem suppliers, were operating at meaningful scale, but they were still structurally downstream from Italian supply chains. The Mafia set the wholesale price. The Mafia determined purity at the point of sale. Independent black traffickers negotiated within a framework they did not control and could not easily escape. The margins available to them were real but bounded. The ceiling was set by whoever controlled importation. Into this ecosystem, in the mid-1960s arrived Frank Lucas. Born on September 9, 1930, in LaGrange, North Carolina, he had caught a Greyhound North in his late teens, moved through Newark, and eventually settled in Harlem. He started by his own account and by law enforcement records as a thief, robbing bars and stores at gunpoint to make quick money. From there, he graduated to the margins of the narcotics trade, working as a street-level dealer, learning the architecture of the business from the bottom up, accumulating contacts and credibility in the way that anyone moving through a criminal economy does, slowly, through demonstrated reliability and controlled violence. By the mid-1960s, he was purchasing heroin through Mafia distributors, same as every other dealer operating in his part of Harlem. The legend that would develop around Frank Lucas over the following 4 decades would describe him as something categorically different. The man who broke the Mafia's monopoly, who traveled personally to Southeast Asia and negotiated a direct supply line, who flooded Harlem with a brand of heroin so pure it killed people before they understood what they had bought, who controlled the entire 116th Street corridor and ran an empire worth tens of millions of dollars. That legend, when measured against the documented record, looks quite different from the inside. But to understand the distance between the myth and the man, you first have to understand the most foundational claim Lucas ever made, the one that preceded everything else. Lucas's central origin story, the one he repeated in every interview, every profile, and every format that would have him, was that he had been taken in and mentored by Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, the most powerful and most feared black gangster in Harlem's history. In Lucas's telling, Johnson had recognized something in him early, brought him on as a driver and personal confidant, and spent years teaching him how the underworld actually operated. When Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, Lucas claimed he was at his side. He said he inherited Johnson's territory, his Mafia relationships, and the institutional knowledge of how to run Harlem's drug trade at the highest level. That story served a precise function. Bumpy Johnson was not merely famous, he was a legend with genuine historical weight. Johnson had spent decades navigating between Harlem's street life and the Genovese crime family, functioning as the Mafia's point of contact in the black community, controlling gambling and narcotics on their behalf, while maintaining enough autonomy to be feared on his own terms. Claiming proximity to Johnson was not just a flex, it was an explanation. It answered the question that anyone examining Lucas's rise would eventually ask: where did this man come from? And who gave him the foundation to do what he did? The answer Lucas provided was, "I came from the top. Bumpy gave me everything." Bumpy Johnson's widow, Mamie Johnson, said her husband never trusted Lucas and referred to him as a flunky. She specifically disputed that Lucas was present when Johnson collapsed and died in a Harlem restaurant, a moment Lucas had described in multiple interviews as deeply personal, as the passing of a torch. Investigative journalist Ron Chepashuk, who spent years examining Lucas's claimed history against available primary sources, found no documentation in court records, law enforcement files, or contemporaneous press coverage that placed Lucas and Johnson's inner circle in any meaningful capacity. Law enforcement investigations of Johnson's operation, conducted during his lifetime, make no mention of Lucas as a significant associate. The connection, as Lucas described it, appears to be a fabrication constructed after the fact, useful precisely because Johnson was dead and could not contradict it. The lynching story served a similar function. Lucas frequently told reporters about a cousin who had been killed by the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina during his childhood, a trauma he said had motivated his hatred of white authority and shaped his entry into crime. Chepashuk investigated this claim and found no evidence of such a lynching. He noted that lynchings in North Carolina during Lucas's youth were rare and documented, and that no record of the incident Lucas described existed. The story appears to have been invented to give his origin a moral framework, to situate his criminality inside a larger history of racial violence and make his choices look like a response to oppression rather than an accumulation of individual decisions. What the actual record shows is that Lucas was, in the late 1960s, a mid-level dealer working a section of the 116th Street corridor in Harlem, purchasing product through Mafia distributors and beginning to assemble around him a network of people he trusted completely, his relatives from North Carolina. He called them the country boys, brothers, cousins, a teenage nephew. They were, by the consistent account of multiple law enforcement investigators, extraordinarily violent. When they moved into a territory, they did not negotiate with the dealers already working it. They threw them off rooftops. They replaced old faces with their own soldiers and dared anyone in the neighborhood to question the transition. Fear, applied consistently and without hesitation, was the country boys' primary market strategy. It worked with brutal efficiency. Before the country boys had a formal structure, before they had a product worth protecting, Lucas had already established the reputation that made his operation possible. The story he told most often, and the one that law enforcement investigators found credible even when other elements of his biography collapsed under scrutiny, was the killing of a street figure he called Tango. Lucas had extended Tango a kilogram of heroin on credit to make a deal. When the deal was done and Lucas came to collect, Tango didn't pay. What happened next, Lucas described with a consistency that suggested either genuine memory or a story practiced until it became indistinguishable from one. Tango was killed. The debt died with him. And every person on that section of Harlem who had watched the exchange understood immediately what the new price of disrespect was going to be. Whether the story is factually precise in every detail is less significant than what it accomplished. In a market where credibility is the foundational currency and where credibility can only be demonstrated through action, a single, visible act of lethal enforcement bought Lucas more operational security than months of careful dealing. People on 116th Street knew what happened to Tango. That knowledge circulated. It preceded Lucas into every subsequent negotiation he entered. His ruthlessness was not incidental to his business. It was the infrastructure on which everything else was built. The condition that made the rest of the operation possible and the thing that the country boys once assembled would scale to a level that eventually drew the attention of two separate federal task forces. By the early 1970s, Lucas was facing a problem that threatened to end his career before it had fully developed. His debts to Italian suppliers had grown to a level that law enforcement would later characterize as genuinely dangerous. DEA wiretaps on Italian-American gangsters in New York captured conversations about killing Frank Lucas, specifically because he owed more than $300,000 and had not paid. The Mafia's supply chain was also under pressure. The US government had financed the destruction of Turkish poppy fields as part of its effort to sever the French connection. And as the traditional supply contracted, wholesale prices rose. Lucas was being squeezed from two directions simultaneously. He owed money he didn't have, and the product he needed to generate that money was getting scarcer and more expensive. That is the actual context in which blue magic appeared on Harlem streets. Not a stroke of strategic genius, a debt crisis with a deadline. The solution that presented itself came through a connection that Lucas would spend years obscuring. What he had found, or what found him, depending on which account you credit, was access to an existing supply chain that dwarfed anything operating in New York at the time. And the man who controlled that supply chain was not a mythological figure from Lucas's self-serving storytelling. He was a former U.S. Army Master Sergeant from North Carolina named Leslie Ike Atkinson, and he had been running the largest Asian heroin smuggling operation in American history for years before Frank Lucas knew his name. Blue Magic, Ike Atkinson, had been building his network since 1968 during the Vietnam War, using the United States military's own infrastructure to move product from Southeast Asia into American cities. He and his associate Herman Jack Jackson purchased heroin directly from poppy fields in the Golden Triangle, the tri-border region encompassing Laos, Burma, and Thailand, at prices that made the economics almost incomprehensible by American street standards. A kilogram of heroin that cost $4,000 to buy at the source sold for $100,000 in the United States. The margin on a single kilogram was $96,000. Atkinson was moving those kilograms in bulk. The smuggling methods he developed evolved over years of trial and refinement. He started by recruiting active duty soldiers to carry product back to the States on leave, concealed in small overnight bags, what GIs called AWOL bags, with false bottom compartments holding approximately 700 grams of pure heroin. When customs scrutiny on military personnel increased, he adapted. Film canisters, leg casts worn by soldiers with fabricated injuries. Eventually, the method that carried the most volume, hollowed out teak furniture, shipped commercially with up to 100 kilos of heroin compressed into the interior cavities. The furniture moved through normal commercial channels. No one questioned it. Atkinson had, over the course of 7 years, built a network of at least 50 dedicated associates and hundreds of GIs who transported product, collected it on the American end, and passed it into distribution channels that stretched from New York to Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., and points on the West Coast. The DEA later estimated that between 1968 and 1975, Atkinson's operation generated $400 million, approximately $1.2 billion in today's money. The DEA administrator, at a press conference announcing the takedown of the network, called it the largest smuggling organization of Asian heroin in American history. Almost no one outside of federal law enforcement knew his name. That anonymity was not accidental. It was the operational discipline of a man who understood that visibility was the primary risk in his business, and who had structured his entire enterprise around the principle of staying unknown. Frank Lucas was Atkinson's distributor in Harlem. That was the arrangement, not a partnership, not a co-equal enterprise. Atkinson supplied. Lucas moved the product in New York and collected money. The terms of the relationship were set by Atkinson and reflected where the actual power sat. When Lucas traveled to Bangkok and pitched himself for a more prominent role, proposing that he become a business partner rather than just a customer, Atkinson listened and declined. He told Lucas he could remain a dealer in Harlem, one of several, and that control of the supply chain itself was not on offer. Atkinson loaned Lucas $25,000 to clear his Mafia debt, a pragmatic move to protect a functioning distribution relationship. But the hierarchy was explicit, and it did not change. Lucas understood exactly what had been said to him. He filed it away and never forgot it. What Lucas did with Atkinson's product within the territory he controlled was real and consequential. The heroin moving through Atkinson's pipeline arrived in New York at a purity level far above what the existing Mafia-supplied market offered. Court testimony from the 1970s established that Lucas's crew received product at approximately 98% purity and cut it to approximately 10% before street distribution. 10% still reads as a small number, but the operative comparison is to the 2 to 5% purity that characterized most street heroin in Harlem during the same period. An addict whose tolerance had calibrated to a 2% product, buying what they believed to be a similar bag at 10%, was not getting a stronger version of the same experience. They were getting something their body had no reference point for. Blue Magic started killing people before law enforcement understood what the brand was or where it was coming from. Overdoses spiked across Harlem, and, as distribution expanded, across New Jersey. The response from addicts was not to avoid the product, it was to seek it more actively. The thing that was killing people was also the thing that worked better than anything else available, and in the economy of addiction, that calculus produces a predictable outcome. Demand for Blue Magic accelerated in direct proportion to the death toll it was generating. The brand became simultaneously a warning and an advertisement. The name itself came from the packaging. Glassine envelopes stamped with a blue logo, consistent and identifiable on the street at a glance, distinguishable from the rotating inventory of brands that cycled through Harlem. Mean Machine, High, The Judge, Harlem Hijack. Lucas maintained tighter quality control than most competitors by routing distribution exclusively through the Country Boys, which meant the product bearing his label stayed closer to the promised purity for longer than rival brands could sustain. The consistency built loyalty. Addicts asked for Blue Magic by name. Dealers who didn't carry it lost customers to those who did. That dynamic is brand management, and it worked the same way it works in any consumer market, with the additional feature that the switching cost for the consumer was their life. What law enforcement discovered when they chemically analyzed, seized Blue Magic packages, however, was something that complicates the myth considerably. The heroin in those envelopes was chemically indistinct from other heroin sources on the market. There was no unique compound, no proprietary formula. The superiority of Blue Magic was a function of the supply chain Ike Atkinson controlled, not of anything Frank Lucas had developed or discovered. The brand was a marketing device layered over a product whose quality derived entirely from a man Lucas preferred not to mention. Lucas claimed, in the New York Magazine profile that would eventually become the foundation for American Gangster, that he was moving $1 million a week in profit. He claimed he had more than 1,000 kilograms in reserve at any given time. He described a cutting operation in which 10 to 12 women worked stripped down to prevent theft. A detail engineered to communicate both the scale of the operation and the completeness of his control over it. He said he owned 116th Street and that no transaction in Harlem happened without his knowledge or approval. These numbers and images have been reproduced in every version of his story that followed, including the film. When police executed the Teaneck raid at what should have been the peak of his operation, they found cash. They found no heroin, no weapons, no evidence of the warehouse-scale enterprise his storytelling implied. That absence is not proof that the operation didn't exist. Dealers don't keep inventory at their personal residence, but it is representative of a consistent pattern. The documented evidence at every point of contact with law enforcement found an operation that was significant but narrower in scope than the claims. The Teaneck raid recovered less than $600,000 in cash. Frank Matthews, operating during the same period, disappeared in 1973 with an estimated $20 million. Nicky Barnes's counsel generated tens of millions annually across multiple suppliers. Lucas's documented assets at the point of his arrest placed him clearly below those figures. The scale comparison matters because Lucas's mythology rests specifically on the claim of dominance. Not just that he was a major player, but that he was the major player, the singular force reshaping Harlem's narcotics market in a way no one before him had managed. That claim does not hold against the documented record of his contemporaries. Frank Matthews had established distribution relationships from the East Coast to the Southwest before Lucas had built anything approaching a regional network. Nicky Barnes was coordinating supply at a volume that drew federal prosecution before Lucas was arrested. The Italian Mafia's importation infrastructure, which continued operating through the mid-1970s largely uninterrupted, dwarfed every black trafficker in New York combined. Lucas was, in the language law enforcement used consistently across multiple investigations, a significant dealer in Harlem, not the architect of a national empire, a significant dealer in one section of one city. What he had, instead of scale, was a reputation built on specificity of violence, and a product that performed better than its competition. The Country Boys enforced the territory in ways that made their presence impossible to ignore or challenge. Rival dealers were thrown from the rooftops of housing projects. Distributors who came up short were taken to the George Washington Bridge and held over the edge until they produced either the money or the names of whoever had taken it. Shorty Lucas, Frank's brother who controlled the New Jersey territory, had built a reputation that law enforcement investigators described, in multiple recorded accounts, as exceeding even Frank's in terms of raw brutality. Shorty was visible in a way that Frank was not. He drove conspicuously. He was known on the streets he controlled by face and name. That visibility would eventually become the thread investigators pulled to unravel the entire operation. Frank, by contrast, managed the architecture. He coordinated the supply relationship with Atkinson. He handled the financial flows, laundering profits through real estate in New Jersey, North Carolina, and the Caribbean, through currency exchanges and shell companies, through mechanisms complex enough to suggest sophistication, but not so complex that they couldn't eventually be traced. Court records from People vs. Lucas show that his operation collected cash payments in supermarkets and laundromats before funneling funds through various shell companies. He maintained a public face that was, in certain respects, deliberately ostentatious. The Small's Paradise appearances, the custom clothing, the proximity to celebrities and athletes. At the 1971 Ali Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden, he appeared in a full-length chinchilla coat and matching hat that reportedly cost $100,000. Law enforcement agents in the crowd noticed him. They noticed who approached him. They noticed the deference. The myth attached to that coat would later frame it as the single mistake that made Lucas a target, the one moment of vanity that cracked his cover. The actual record shows that investigators had been tracking Lucas since at least 1970, and that two separate task forces were building files on him long before the fight. The coat didn't create the investigation. It confirmed what investigators already suspected, that whoever Frank Lucas was, he was much more than what he appeared to be on paper. The coffin story deserves its own accounting, because it became the most repeated and most cinematic element of the Lucas mythology, and because it is also the element most thoroughly contradicted by the people who would know. Lucas claimed, in his New York Magazine interview and in subsequent accounts, that he and Ike Atkinson had arranged to smuggle heroin inside the caskets of American soldiers killed in Vietnam, hiding kilos of product in false bottoms, or in later versions of the story, inside the bodies themselves. The image was designed to be unforgettable. It positioned Lucas as someone willing to cross a line so transgressive that it put him in a category beyond ordinary criminal. It also placed him at the center of the Southeast Asian supply chain, which was the structural claim that mattered most to his legend. DEA agent Charles Lutz, who was stationed in Bangkok during the relevant period and investigated the supply network extensively, wrote that there was no evidence of heroin ever being seized from servicemen's coffins, not a single documented seizure. He explained that Atkinson and Jackson used AWOL bags, furniture, and military mail, not coffins, and that the coffin story was a media sensationalization of isolated incidents that bore no resemblance to the actual method. Atkinson himself, in multiple interviews over many years, called the coffin story the biggest hoax ever perpetuated and denied it categorically. This is significant not because Atkinson was a reliable narrator, he was a convicted drug trafficker, but because he had no incentive to deny the coffin story if it were true. The method was already known to law enforcement. Denying it gained him nothing. He denied it anyway, consistently, until his death. Federal Judge Sterling Johnson Jr., who had led the prosecutions against Lucas, later said the film American Gangster was 1% reality and 99% Hollywood, and stated explicitly that Lucas lacked the independent capability to establish a Southeast Asian supply chain on his own. He credited Atkinson as the architect. The DEA record supports that assessment. The coffin story was a device, vivid, transgressive, and false. The Informant. By the end of 1973, two separate law enforcement teams were moving toward Frank Lucas from opposite directions, and critically, neither had full visibility into what the other was doing. That separation was not bureaucratic negligence, it was deliberate. Investigators on both sides of the Hudson River had decided not to share information because they didn't trust each other, and because each team wanted to be the one to take Lucas down. Police corruption was pervasive enough during that period that sharing intelligence felt like a way to lose it. In New Jersey, Richie Roberts had assembled the Z Team, a joint task force of state detectives and DEA special agents built specifically around the Blue Magic investigation. They had identified Shorty Lucas as a key operative and had been running surveillance on him for months without being able to establish a direct evidentiary link to Frank. A chemical analysis of seized blue magic samples, processed through the DEA's lab, returned a result that placed the heroin's origin in Southeast Asia, which was new information in a market that had been fed almost exclusively by European refined Turkish product for decades. Roberts knew the supply was Asian. He didn't know how it was getting into the country, and he couldn't prove who was coordinating it. In New York, Assistant U.S. Attorney Dominic Amorosa had reached Frank Lucas through a completely separate chain of evidence. His team had been building a narcotics case against an Italian dealer named Anthony Vizzini, a Mafia associate who operated as a heroin supplier to multiple buyers in the city. The investigation used a DEA informant named Jimmy Cohan, who had met Vizzini in a New York State prison after Vizzini's crew protected him during a racial fight inside the facility. Cohan had maintained contact with Vizzini after both were released and was making controlled heroin purchases from him while wearing a wire for the DEA. In one of those recorded conversations, Vizzini named Frank Lucas as a major buyer who owed him over $300,000 and had stopped paying. Vizzini, in that same conversation, asked Cohan to kill Lucas over the debt. The subsequent raid on Vizzini's apartment produced 26 pounds of heroin and a set of handwritten ledgers. Inside those ledgers were Frank Lucas's name, attached to specific transaction dates, specific quantities of product, and the exact dollar amounts paid and owed. That was the hard evidence Amorosa's team needed. Not a tip from an informant, not surveillance footage, but a dealer's own bookkeeping records documenting the relationship in his own handwriting. Vizzini was offered the standard choice: cooperate or face the full weight of the charges. He talked. He provided dates, amounts, and direct testimony connecting Lucas to a pattern of major heroin purchases. The New York team moved immediately. On January 18, 1975, agents arrived at the Teaneck address and knocked on the door. Frank Lucas answered it. He was alone. He had no warning, no armed protection, no exit strategy. What followed? His wife at the window, the money on the lawn, the 7 suitcases of cash, played out in less than an hour. In total, nearly $585,000 was seized, counted twice in front of witnesses, sealed in evidence containers, and transported under guard. Lucas watched the counting without speaking. He understood what it meant for what came next. He was charged with conspiracy to distribute heroin and remanded without bail. Julie Lucas was charged with obstruction. The man who had claimed to own Harlem was in federal custody before noon. Roberts in New Jersey had been watching the New York arrest from across the river, frustrated that his team hadn't gotten there first, but determined to build his own independent case. He kept going. In the months following Lucas's arrest, intelligence came in about a heroin shipment moving up from North Carolina toward Newark. Roberts debated letting it run, watching where it went, who collected it, how it moved through the distribution chain, but ultimately made the call to intercept. His reasoning was direct. If they let it onto the street, people would die. He ordered the takedown. The raid on the Newark apartment, being used as the country boys' distribution point, recovered approximately $10 million worth of heroin, along with cutting paraphernalia in prepackaged glassine envelopes. Among those arrested was Frank Lucas's 17-year-old nephew. A New Jersey judge informed the boy that the quantity of narcotics involved meant he was facing the possibility of a life sentence. The nephew talked. Not reluctantly, not under sustained pressure. He talked immediately and with remarkable specificity. Investigators said he had what amounted to a photographic memory for the operational details of the Country Boys distribution network. Dates, locations, delivery routes, the names of who controlled what territory, at what level of the organization. They went back and checked his account against surveillance records and independent intelligence. It held up at every point. The nephew's testimony drew a direct and documented line from Newark street corners, up through Shorty Lucas and into Frank Lucas at the top. Roberts now had what he needed for a separate New Jersey prosecution. Lucas was tried in New York first. The conviction came on the weight of Vizzini's ledgers, the cash seized in Teaneck, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses. He received a 40-year federal sentence. Then Roberts brought his case in a New Jersey courtroom, and the trial turned on a moment that no one who was present has forgotten. Roberts called a single witness the defense had no way to prepare for, a woman from the Newark housing projects whose daughter had died of a blue magic overdose. She described, in plain and specific language, finding her daughter on the bathroom floor of their apartment with a needle still in her arm and a glassine envelope on the tile beside her. When she finished testifying, there was complete silence in the courtroom. Defense counsel declined to ask a single cross-examination question. Not one. Lucas was convicted. The New Jersey sentence added 30 years to the 40 he was already facing. A combined exposure of 70 years in 2 separate jurisdictions, with sentences structured to run consecutively. He was, by any reasonable calculation, never going to be free again. Roberts, after the verdict, received word that Lucas wanted to speak with him privately. They met in a small holding cell in the Essex County Courthouse. Lucas said simply, "I never thought about it that way." He was talking about the woman and her daughter. Then he told Roberts that if he was convicted, which he already had been, he would be in touch. Roberts understood what that meant. The cooperation began in 1977. Lucas signed an agreement for full use immunity, meaning his statements could not be used against him in additional prosecutions. In exchange, he agreed to provide information on anyone and everyone prosecutors asked about. He later told reporters that what he'd given up was limited, that he'd only exposed corrupt police officers, that he had not named his criminal associates, that some version of a code had governed what he revealed and what he protected. That account is contradicted by nearly every primary source that exists. Court records, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who worked the case consistently stated that Lucas's cooperation led to the conviction of more than 100 narcotics dealers. His testimony targeted not only corrupt police, but traffickers across multiple organizations, people he had done business with directly, people in his own operation, and people in adjacent networks he had knowledge of. Federal Judge Sterling Johnson Jr., who had overseen the original prosecutions, described Lucas as the biggest snitch I ever had, and said he didn't know anyone who had made more cases. That assessment came from a federal judge who had processed the results of that cooperation firsthand. The gap between what Lucas actually did in those cooperation sessions and what he later claimed he did is itself a significant piece of the story. He understood once he was out of prison and building his public profile that the cooperation was the most vulnerable part of his biography, the element that most directly contradicted the image of a principled self-made operator who played by his own rules. He managed it the same way he managed every other uncomfortable fact in his history. He reframed it. Instead of naming everyone he knew, he claimed to have named only the corrupt. Instead of describing full cooperation, he described selective assistance. Instead of a man who gave up over 100 people to buy his freedom, he presented a man who had targeted institutional rot while protecting his people. The record says otherwise. But the record for most of the people who encountered the Frank Lucas story was not the version they saw first. The film American Gangster would later claim, in closing title cards, that Lucas's cooperation resulted in the conviction of 3/4 of New York's DEA. Prosecutors confirmed that claim was false. No DEA agents were convicted as a result of Lucas's testimony. Some corrupt NYPD officers were implicated. Drug dealers across multiple networks were convicted. But the characterization of Lucas as the man who cleaned out law enforcement corruption was a narrative invention, not a documented outcome. What Lucas gave up most consequentially, the cooperation that carried the most structural weight, was Ike Atkinson. In his sessions with federal prosecutors, Lucas described Atkinson's operation in detail that only someone with direct knowledge of it could provide. The Bangkok bar that served as Atkinson's base of operations, the network of military contacts, the teak furniture shipments, the scope and geography of the distribution network. Atkinson was arrested, charged and pleaded guilty. He received an initial sentence of 19 years. The man who had operated invisibly for 7 years, who had built what the DEA called the largest Asian heroin smuggling organization in American history, was identifiable to law enforcement because Frank Lucas, facing the rest of his life in federal custody, decided that the price of silence was no longer manageable. Atkinson continued running his operation from inside prison. He received an additional 13 years for that, ultimately serving a total of 32 years before his release in 2007. When American Gangster came out that same year, and he watched Frank Lucas receive cinematic credit for a supply chain he had built and operated, Atkinson called Richie Roberts. He said that Frank hadn't done it, that he had controlled Asia, that he deserved the recognition. Then he said he was going to go to New York and kill Frank Lucas. Roberts asked him how old he was. Atkinson said he was 80. Roberts told him to find a rocking chair. Atkinson died in 2014 at the age of 88. In 1981, a federal judge suspended Lucas's 40-year federal sentence. His state sentence was reduced to time served. He walked out of custody after approximately 7 years, placed on lifetime parole, briefly entered a witness protection arrangement, and relocated. Within 3 years of his release, he was arrested again, attempting to purchase a kilogram of cocaine. He was sentenced to 7 years and served the full term, released in 1991. He was 60 years old. He had been through 2 separate periods of federal incarceration, had given up over 100 people, and had watched the heroin market he operated within absorb his absence without interruption. New Dominican and Colombian trafficking networks had filled the distribution void almost immediately after his arrest. The structural conditions that had made Blue Magic possible, poverty, addiction, supply chains built on corrupted military infrastructure and indifferent institutions, had not changed. The brand was gone. The market kept moving. In the years after his final release, Lucas built something that his criminal enterprise had never quite managed to make permanent: a story. He sold film rights. He consulted on American Gangster. He participated in documentaries. He gave interviews in which the details of his cooperation shifted depending on the audience, the year, and how much scrutiny he was operating under. The New York Magazine profile that launched his legend publicly was written by Mark Jacobson and relayed Lucas's accounts with minimal independent verification. The narrative Lucas had been refining across decades. The self-made black entrepreneur who bypassed the Mafia, who went to Asia himself, who gave up bad cops and protected his people, reached millions of people through a major studio film with a $100 million budget and Denzel Washington's face attached to it. Ron Chapishuk, who spent years examining Lucas's claims against primary sources, found that his accounts changed across interviews, that biographical elements were fabricated, and that people who actually knew him in Harlem, including Bumpy Johnson's widow, viewed him as a combination of fraud and traitor. That assessment never got a wide release. What remains, when the mythology is stripped away, is not nothing. Frank Lucas moved significant quantities of heroin through Harlem and New Jersey during one of the most destructive periods in the history of the American drug epidemic. The country boys were real, and their violence was real, and it was documented by multiple law enforcement investigators who were there. Blue Magic as a brand was real, and its elevated purity contributed directly to overdose deaths across 2 states over multiple years. The money Lucas accumulated was real, even when the specific figures he claimed don't match the amounts investigators actually recovered. His cooperation was real, and its breadth was real, and it damaged the lives of over 100 people who had trusted him or worked alongside him. What's also real is that none of that required the mythology to be significant. The actual facts. A man from rural North Carolina who built a distribution network in Harlem, who connected to a former Army sergeant running the largest Asian heroin pipeline in U.S. history, who survived the whole structure by giving up everyone he knew, are specific enough to account for what happened without embellishment. The myth was constructed on top of that documented reality to serve a function. It positioned Lucas not as a distributor in someone else's supply chain, but as the originating architect of his own empire. It made his connection to Atkinson disappear entirely, replacing the actual supply relationship with a solo adventure story set in Bangkok. It transformed his cooperation, the most complete and consequential cooperation of any major trafficker in the case's history, into a limited and principled act of exposing police corruption. It gave his violence a strategic logic it didn't always have, and it turned the harm he caused, the overdoses, the addiction, the bodies at the base of housing projects, into the collateral damage of a larger narrative about black entrepreneurship challenging white institutional control. The myth also survived because it was marketed more aggressively than the truth. Hollywood had a budget, Chepashuk had a byline, Lucas had Denzel Washington, Atkinson had 32 years in a federal penitentiary, and a phone call to Richie Roberts that ended with an old man in North Carolina being told to buy a rocking chair. The institutions that constructed the Lucas legend, a New York magazine with talented writers, a film studio with hundreds of millions of dollars, and Lucas himself as the primary source, had every incentive to tell the most compelling version of the story rather than the most accurate one. The accurate one was messier. It had more people in it. It required understanding a supply chain that crossed 3 continents and a military bureaucracy that had been partially hollowed out by corruption and wartime chaos. The simplified version had one man, one brand, and one city. That version fits on a movie poster. He was not the architect. The architecture belonged to Ike Atkinson, who built the pipeline, controlled the supply, set the terms of the relationship, and ultimately paid for all of it with 32 years of his life, while Frank Lucas paid with 7 and came out with a film deal. That asymmetry is the actual ending of this story, and it is the one that neither the legend nor the film was designed to tell. The addicts in those housing projects, the ones who couldn't handle a 10% bag when they'd only ever known 2%, the ones whose mothers testified in Essex County courtrooms without a cross-examination question asked, did not get to choose which version of this story was true. They lived inside the version that was.